The alarm clock read 5:43 a.m. when James Sullivan opened his eyes in the darkness, 17 minutes before the buzzer would shatter what passed for sleep these days. He'd learned months ago that waking before the alarm gave him those stolen moments to prepare for consciousness, to remember where he was and why the bed felt too empty, to construct the psychological armor that would carry him through another day of pretending everything was manageable for a 7-year-old who still sometimes called out for his mother in the night. He silenced the alarm before it could sound muscle memory, guiding his hand through pre-dawn blackness that filled the studio apartment like stagnant water. The space was small enough that James could navigate it blind 12 steps from the bed he shared with Noah to the kitchenette that occupied one corner and 8 steps to the bathroom that leaked and had mold growing in corners. The landlord refused to acknowledge 4 steps to the window that looked out on Dorchester streets, where garbage accumulated and sirens provided constant soundtrack to urban survival. Noah slept beside him in the double bed they'd pushed against the wall, small body curled under blankets that James had bought at Goodwill 3 months ago, when the temperatures dropped and the heating in their building became theoretical rather than functional. His son's blonde hair, Rachel's hair always Rachel's, never James's darker coloring, spread across the pillow face peaceful in ways that made James's chest ache with the weight of everything Noah didn't know he was missing. James sat up carefully, movements calibrated to avoid disturbing his son, and allowed himself exactly 30 seconds of stillness before the day demanded motion. Those 30 seconds were ritual, the brief window where he didn't have to perform competence or project stability or pretend that working 3 jobs to stay barely above water was sustainable long-term strategy rather than desperate short-term survival. 30 seconds. Then reality reasserted itself with the efficiency of a closing trap. He stood and walked to the bathroom, avoiding the loose floorboard that squeaked and would wake Noah, who needed every minute of sleep before Mrs. Chen arrived at 6:15 to take him for the day. The bathroom mirror showed a man who looked older than 35, exhaustion, carved into features that Rachel used to call handsome, back when James had energy to care about his appearance. Brown hair that needed cutting stubble, that would have to wait for his 1 day off each week to shave properly, shoulders that were broader than 3 years ago because maintenance work required lifting equipment designed to test the limits of human endurance. 3 exhaustions. That was the mathematics of survival in Boston when you were a single father with a son who needed shoes every 3 months because children grew with the relentless inevitability of weeds pushing through concrete. Mornings, James worked maintenance at Beacon Hill Café, 6 a.m. to 2 p.m., $14 an hour, to keep the infrastructure of a budget establishment functioning, while customers complained about coffee temperature and questioned whether the bathrooms met basic sanitation standards. Afternoons, he drove delivery routes for a logistics company that paid $13.50 per hour plus tips that materialized with the frequency of solar eclipses navigating Boston traffic that made every route feel like combat operation conducted in a vehicle that was one mechanical failure away from catastrophic breakdown. Evenings when he could secure the shifts, he picked up catering work or odd jobs, cash payments that didn't appear on tax forms and which James justified by telling himself that survival required moral flexibility about reporting requirements. $42,000 a year, gross income before taxes and Social Security, and all the other mechanisms through which the government extracted its percentage from people who could least afford the extraction. $180,000 in debt from Rachel's medical bills and the funeral costs in the 3 months when grief had made James non-functional in ways that destroyed his previous employment and consumed their savings and left them scrambling for footing that had never quite returned. The math didn't work, had never worked. Every month was triage, deciding which bills could be delayed and which creditors would actually sue versus those who just send threatening letters that James had learned to ignore with the practiced detachment of someone who understood that worry without actionable solution was just wasted emotional energy. But Noah had food and clothes and a roof over his head, and that was what mattered. That was the only calculation that actually counted when James woke at 5:43 a.m. and built his armor and prepared to spend another day making himself invisible to people who'd never had to choose between electricity and groceries. He dressed in the uniform that Beacon Hill Cafe provided, navy blue work pants that were fraying at the seams, matching button-up shirt with the cafe logo embroidered over the heart in thread that was fading to gray work boots that were supposed to last 6 months, but which James had been stretching into their 14th month of service through careful applications of duct tape and willpower. The shirt was clean because James did laundry every Sunday night without fail in the building's basement machines that charged $2 per cycle and which broke down with enough regularity that he'd learned basic appliance repair through necessity rather than choice. The kitchenette was barely functional hot plate instead of stove because the landlord had removed the actual stove after the previous tenant had started a fire mini fridge that made sounds suggesting imminent mechanical death sink with faucet that dripped constantly and which had stained the basin with rust-colored mineral deposits that no amount of scrubbing could remove. James started coffee in the machine Rachel had insisted on buying 4 years ago when they'd still believed in futures that included luxuries like automated brewing systems, one of those single-serve pod contraptions that was environmentally irresponsible, but which James couldn't bring himself to replace because Rachel had loved her morning coffee, and sometimes keeping her ghost alive meant keeping her appliances. While the coffee brewed with the grinding mechanical sounds that probably violated noise ordinances, James checked his phone. 3 texts from his delivery company supervisor asking if he could add an extra route today because someone had called in sick and they needed coverage desperately enough to ask on a Sunday, which was technically James's one day off, except that days off were theoretical constructs when you were poor. He calculated quickly. Extra route meant 4 additional hours, roughly $60 after taxes, and Mrs. Chen had already confirmed she could keep Noah until 8 p.m. if absolutely necessary. $60 was groceries for a week if he shopped at Market Basket, instead of the closer but more expensive options if he stuck to generic brands and ignored Noah's requests for the cereals with cartoon characters that cost $3 more per box. He texted back confirmation that he'd take the shift, watched the supervisor's response materialize with gratitude that felt like exploitation disguised as appreciation, then pocketed the phone and drank his coffee, standing over the sink because sitting down to drink, it would make the morning feel less urgent, and urgency was the only thing keeping James moving most days. Through the window above the sink, Boston was transitioning from night to dawn, streetlights still glowing against sky that was shifting from black to deep blue, streaked with the orange pollution glow that characterized urban sunrise. In 6 hours, he'd be navigating those streets with packages that needed delivering to addresses that were never quite where GPS claimed they should be. In 14 hours, he'd collapse into this bed next to Noah and sleep until the alarm went off at 5:43 a.m., and the cycle repeated with the grinding inevitability of machinery that couldn't be stopped, only endured. Noah's bedroom door was just the curtain James had hung to create the illusion of privacy in a space that had none fabric decorated with dinosaurs that Noah had picked out himself 3 months ago, when James had let him choose from the clearance options at Target. James pulled the curtain aside quietly and looked at his son, sleeping small face, peaceful in ways that 7-year-olds deserved to be peaceful, unmarked by the anxieties that would come soon enough when childhood ended and reality asserted its demands. Rachel would have been better at this. The thought arrived with the familiar weight of all the thoughts James tried to suppress, but which surfaced anyway during vulnerable moments when his defenses were weakened by exhaustion. Rachel had been natural at parenting in ways that James had to learn through trial and error, and constant fear that he was damaging Noah through incompetence disguised as effort. She'd known instinctively when Noah needed comfort versus when he needed space, had understood how to translate 7-year-old emotional turmoil into language that made sense, had possessed patience that James had to manufacture through conscious effort. But Rachel was dead, had been dead for 3 years, had died on Route 93, when a drunk driver crossed the median and turned James's entire world into twisted metal and shattered glass, and the smell of antiseptic in the ICU and the sound of machines beeping their measured countdown to the moment when the beeping stopped, and doctors with sympathetic expressions explained that there was nothing more they could do, and would James like some time alone to say goodbye. He'd said goodbye, had held Rachel's hand while she died, had whispered promises he didn't know if he could keep about taking care of Noah and making sure their son remembered her and not letting grief consume him so completely that Noah lost both parents instead of just one. Had made those promises while Rachel's hand went cold in his and her chest stopped rising and the machines delivered their final monotone announcement that life had ended and James was alone with a 4-year-old who still asked when mommy was coming home. 3 years. It should have gotten easier by now, everyone said. Time heals all wounds, they said. Life goes on, they said. And James had smiled and nodded and lied about feeling better, while internally cataloging all the ways that grief didn't heal. It just changed shape, became something you carried instead of something that carried you, transformed from acute agony into chronic ache that colored everything without quite destroying anything. At 6:13 a.m., Mrs. Chen knocked 3 times in the pattern that meant everything was routine and safe. James opened the door to find his neighbor standing in the hallway wearing the quilted bathrobe she lived in during Boston winters, gray hair in curlers that she never seemed to remove, holding the thermal mug of tea she brought every morning like talisman against the cold. Mrs. Chen was 71 years old, retired from teaching elementary school for the Boston public school system, living alone in the apartment next door since her husband had died 6 years ago from the cancer that had consumed him over 18 months of treatments that ultimately proved futile. She'd started watching Noah 2 years ago when James's previous childcare arrangement had fallen through, and he'd been desperate enough to knock on her door at 11 p.m. and beg for help with the kind of raw desperation that made pride irrelevant. She'd agreed to help temporarily, then temporary had become permanent. Then permanent had become family in the way that sometimes happened when geography and necessity aligned. Her voice carried the soft accent of someone who'd grown up speaking Cantonese before English words, shaped by linguistic patterns that had never quite disappeared despite 60 years of American citizenship. "You look terrible, James. Are you sleeping?" James managed something approximating a smile. "Working. Same thing these days." "Not the same thing. Working is what you do during the day. Sleeping is what you do at night, so you don't collapse from exhaustion and leave your son without a parent." She stepped inside with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd been doing this routine long enough to navigate his apartment blind. "When was the last time you had a full night's sleep?" "I'll sleep when they start paying me enough to afford it," Mrs. Chen made the disapproving sound that James had learned meant she wanted to argue but recognized the futility of arguing with economic realities that couldn't be changed through force of will alone. Instead, she moved toward Noah's sleeping area with the quiet competence of someone who'd spent 40 years waking children gently. James followed, watching as Mrs. Chen knelt beside the bed and touched Noah's shoulder with grandmother tenderness that made James's throat tighten. His son's eyes opened slowly, confusion transitioning to recognition, then to something that made James's chest ache. Noah's voice was sleep rough, but carried the hope that killed James a little bit every time he heard it. "Is today the day Mommy comes back?" The question arrived like clockwork, twice a week minimum, despite every gentle explanation James had offered about death, meaning permanent absence. 4-year-olds hadn't understood permanence. 7-year-olds understood it intellectually but rejected it emotionally. Kept hoping that maybe the adults were wrong about death being final, kept asking when the person who'd left was coming home. Mrs. Chen glanced at James with expression that mixed sympathy with concern that had become familiar over 2 years of shared mornings, then turned back to Noah with practiced deflection. "Today is Sunday, sweetheart. On Sundays we have pancakes for breakfast, and then we watch cartoons, and maybe we go to the park if it's warm enough. Remember you wanted to feed the ducks at the pond." The redirection worked because 7-year-olds could be diverted by routine and promises of favorite activities. Noah climbed out of bed, stuffed elephant clutched against his chest, the elephant Rachel had bought when they'd learned she was pregnant, back when their biggest worry was choosing nursery colors and reading parenting books that made everything sound manageable. James left at 6:28 a.m. with Noah still in his pajamas and Mrs. Chen making reassuring sounds about pancakes and ducks and all the small certainties that made childhood feel stable, even when nothing underneath was actually stable at all. The commute to Beacon Hill Cafe took 43 minutes and on the T, when trains ran on schedule longer when they didn't, which was most mornings, because the Massachusetts Bay Transportation Authority operated with the efficiency of bureaucracy, designed by people who'd never actually had to rely on public transportation for survival. James stood pressed between other early morning commuters, who all shared the same exhausted expressions and the same careful avoidance of eye contact that characterized urban existence, everyone performing the delicate dance of occupying minimal space while pretending the other humans surrounding them didn't exist. The cafe occupied the ground floor of a brick building on a side street off Charles Street, the kind of establishment that survived through serving working-class breakfast to people who couldn't afford the gentrified options that had colonized Beacon Hill like invasive species. The building was old, probably historical by Boston standards, though nobody seemed interested in historical designation that would increase property taxes without increasing revenue. Cracked windows, exterior paint, peeling front door that stuck and required shoulder force to open fully. James entered through the employee entrance in the alley, the pathway designed to keep staff invisible to customers who shouldn't have to acknowledge the humans who maintain their morning routines. The employee area was in the basement space with flickering fluorescent lights that probably violated electrical codes and folding chairs that had seen better decades and a coffee machine that produced liquid tasting approximately like what James imagined motor oil would taste like if motor oil could be legally served to humans. His manager, Kevin had quit 2 months ago. Robert Brennan was the new manager hired to increase profitability through mechanisms that primarily involve cutting costs and increasing expectations and making everyone miserable in service of margins that improve by fractions of percentage points. But Robert wasn't here yet. The cafe was still quiet, just the ambient sounds of old buildings settling and ancient heating systems clanking to life and the distant noise of Boston waking up around them. Diane Foster arrived at 5:52 a.m., cigarette smell, clinging to her uniform like accusation. She was 42, divorced, bitter about both the divorce and the circumstances that had led to it. Waitress at Beacon Hill Cafe for 8 years, which was 7 years longer than anyone should work anywhere that paid what this place paid. Her voice carried the rough edge of someone who smoked too much and slept too little. "You're here early." "Couldn't sleep." "Noah, okay. He's fine. Mrs. Chen's got him." Diane poured herself coffee from the machine that tasted like regret and leaned against the counter with the posture of someone who'd given up on good posture years ago. "Robert's been asking questions about you." "What kind of questions?" "The kind managers ask when they're building a case for firing someone." She took a sip, grimaced at the taste, but drank it anyway because caffeine was caffeine regardless of palatability. Something about waste, about giving away product. James kept his expression neutral because showing emotion around Diane was like showing weakness around sharks. It just encouraged predatory behavior. "I haven't been wasting anything." "That's not what I said. I said that's what Robert's saying." She studied him with eyes that missed very little, despite appearing perpetually half-closed from exhaustion. "You've been feeding that homeless woman who comes in, the one who sits in the corner. She's a customer. She pays in change and doesn't cover half her order. That's not a customer. That's charity we can't afford." James didn't respond because arguing with Diane was like arguing with economic systems technically possible, but ultimately futile because the fundamental structures remained unchanged regardless of how compelling your arguments were. Carlos Ruiz arrived at 6:04 a.m. and started the grill without speaking. Practiced movements of someone who'd been cooking breakfast in establishments exactly like this one for 30 years across 2 countries and 3 languages. He was 50 immigrant from El Salvador who'd fled civil war in the 80s and who'd spent 3 decades building life in America that looked nothing like the life he'd imagined when he crossed the border with $200 and hoped that had proven more durable than the money. He and James had an understanding built on shared recognition that talking about their lives made the weight too real to carry. They worked in parallel, acknowledged each other's presence without requiring conversation, respected the silence that was sometimes the only gift people in their circumstances could offer each other. Robert Brennan arrived at 6:27 a.m., wearing a suit that cost more than James made in 2 weeks, carrying a leather briefcase that probably cost more than James made in a month, projecting the kind of professional competence that came from MBA programs and management seminars, an absolute certainty that business success was just a matter of implementing correct systems with sufficient rigor. His voice carried forced enthusiasm that made James want to throw something heavy at him. "Morning, team. Let's make today count." The phrase landed like insult disguised as motivation. Making days count when you were earning $14 an hour and wondering whether you could keep the electricity on felt like being told to appreciate the view while drowning. James nodded and returned to prep work, filling sugar dispensers and checking coffee supplies and performing the routine that he could execute without conscious thought after 2 years of identical mornings. At 6:34 a.m., the front door opened and James looked up out of habit ingrained from years of service work that required constant awareness of customer presence. The woman who entered looked like she'd materialized from a different era, from Depression-era photographs of migrants fleeing dust bowls from historical documentation of poverty that Americans like to believe existed only in past tense. She was late 30s or maybe 40, difficult to assess beneath the layers of exhaustion and neglect that covered her like second skin designed to repel human connection. Dark jacket that had probably been donated to Goodwill by someone who'd owned it 10 years ago. Fabric faded from its original color to something approaching gray cuffs frayed and showing the white threads underneath. Her hair hung unwashed around her face long enough that she could have pulled it back, but instead let it fall loose like curtain designed to hide rather than frame. Streaked with gray that might have been premature or might have been accurate depending on how hard her life had been and how long she'd been living it. She didn't make eye contact with anyone, didn't acknowledge the other early customers who were filtering in for their morning coffee and bagels and whatever small rituals sustained them through days that probably felt as heavy as James's own days felt. Just moved directly to the back corner table by the window that looked out onto the alley where dumpsters overflowed and homeless people sometimes slept, and the reality that Beacon Hill tried to hide from its wealthier residents was on full display. James had seen her before. She'd started appearing about 2 weeks ago. Always same time somewhere between 6:30 and 6:45. Always same table, always alone. Always carrying that quality of invisibility that homeless people developed when they'd been looked through often enough that they learned to facilitate the looking through by making themselves as unobtrusive as possible. Diane leaned against the counter and watched the woman sit down, voice low enough that customers wouldn't hear, but loud enough that James definitely would. She's back. Yeah. You going to serve her? That's generally how cafes work. Diane made a sound that might have been laugh or might have been expression of disgust, hard to distinguish between the two, with Diane who seemed to find most of existence worthy of disgust. She never pays full price. Last time she gave me like $2 for a $5 order and then just sat there expecting me to accept it. Did you accept it? What was I supposed to do? Make a scene over $3, but it's stealing James. She's stealing from us. James didn't respond because engaging with Diane's sense of victimization would require energy he didn't have and would accomplish nothing except making both of them more miserable than they already were. He just grabbed a pot of coffee from the warmer and a small plate from the stack beside the prep station. He put 2 slices of bread in the toaster while the heating elements glowed red and ticked with the sound of metal expanding. When they popped up golden brown, he buttered them with practiced efficiency, born from making Noah's breakfast every morning for 7 years, then cut them into smaller pieces habit, from when Noah had been younger and needed food in manageable portions, but which James had never quite abandoned because the muscle memory was stronger than the logical need. He arranged the toast pieces on the plate, poured coffee into a ceramic mug rather than the to-go cups they usually used because something about serving homeless people in disposable containers felt like additional insult added to the injury of their circumstances, then walked toward the back corner where the woman sat staring out the window at nothing in particular. She looked up when he approached and James felt something in his chest tighten at the expression in her eyes. Exhaustion, yes. Resignation, definitely. But something else underneath, something that looked like intelligence and awareness, in the sense that this woman was fundamentally present in ways that contradicted her appearance of having checked out from regular human existence. He set the coffee and toast down without speaking, not because he was trying to be rude, but because he genuinely didn't know what to say that wouldn't sound either condescending or intrusive. Her voice was quiet when she spoke, rough from not being used frequently, but carrying undertones that suggested education and background that didn't align with her current presentation. How much? Don't worry about it. I need to pay. She reached into her jacket pocket with movements that suggested the action required more effort than it should have required, pulled out a handful of coins and placed them on the table with care that suggested each coin represented calculation and sacrifice. Quarters and Ds and nickels and pennies arranged in small piles like she was organizing them by denomination before counting. She counted slowly, fingers trembling slightly in ways that might have been cold or might have been something medical or might have been just the physical manifestation of stress that came from living without adequate nutrition or shelter or safety. When she finished counting, She pushed the coins toward James with expression that mixed hope and fear in equal measure. $1.87. Not enough for both the coffee and the toast, not even close to enough if you calculated based on menu prices that charge $3 for coffee and $4 for 2 pieces of toast because Beacon Hill rents were expensive and operating costs were high and profit margins were thin. James looked at the coins for a moment, then at her. She was watching him with eyes that suggested she knew exactly how inadequate her payment was and was waiting for the rejection she'd probably experienced countless times before, waiting for him to tell her that her money wasn't enough and she needed to leave and she didn't belong in spaces where people with wealth and futures gathered for their morning rituals. The words came out quiet, almost automatic. "It's fine." She blinked surprise, flickering across features that had probably forgotten how to register surprise. "What? It's fine, don't worry about the money." Her throat worked like she was trying to swallow around something sharp, trying to process this small act of acceptance that probably felt enormous when you lived in a world that constantly reinforced your worthlessness. She nodded once slowly, then looked down at the plate. James walked back to the counter where Diane was watching with expression that clearly communicated her opinion about his decision-making capabilities. Her voice dripped with the condescension that Diane had perfected over 8 years of service work that had ground her down into someone who resented kindness because kindness made her feel guilty about her own lack of kindness. "You know she's never going to pay full price, right?" James shrugged and poured himself coffee from the pot he'd used for the woman's cup. The coffee that was marginally better than what came out of the employee machine, but still tasted like it had been brewed with water that had passed through pipes installed when Kennedy was president. "She's not bothering anyone. She's bothering me, makes the place look bad." James took a sip of coffee that was too hot and tasted metallic but which contained caffeine, and caffeine was the only thing that mattered at 6:47 in the morning when you'd woken up at 5:43 and had 14 more hours of work ahead of you. "Then maybe stop looking at her." Diane made a sound of disgust, but didn't continue the argument, just grabbed the coffee pot and went to refill customers who were actually paying full price and therefore deserved her attention. James turned back to look at the woman in the corner. She was drinking her coffee slowly, both hands wrapped around the mug like she was trying to absorb its warmth through her palms. The toast sat untouched for a long moment before she finally picked up a piece and ate it with careful, deliberate movements that suggested eating might hurt or might be something she approached with caution after too many meals that hadn't stayed down. Something about the way she held herself, the way she occupied the chair, like she was trying to take up minimal space, the way she kept her eyes down and her shoulders curved inward, it all communicated a story James didn't know, but could recognize the outlines of. This was someone who'd learned to make herself small, who'd discovered that invisibility was survival strategy in a world that punished visibility. The morning shift proceeded with the grinding routine of breakfast service at a cafe that served people who couldn't afford better options. James worked the counter, made coffee, toasted bread, cleaned tables, performed all the small tasks that kept the establishment functioning while customers consumed their morning calories and complained about things that weren't worth complaining about, but which they complained about anyway because complaining was free and made them feel like they had some control over their circumstances. The woman stayed in her corner, didn't order anything else, didn't ask for refills, just sat there with her empty cup and her empty plate and her notebook that she pulled from her jacket pocket after she'd finished eating small, leather-bound thing that looked like it had survived decades of use and was barely holding together through determination rather than structural integrity. She wrote in the notebook for almost an hour, pen moving across pages in neat lines that James could see from the counter, even though he couldn't read the actual words. Her handwriting was precise despite her shaking hands, each letter formed carefully like she was trying to preserve something important that might otherwise be lost. At 8:47 a.m., she stood and walked toward the door without making eye contact with anyone. The coins she'd placed on the table remained there abandoned, like offering to gods who'd proven themselves indifferent. James walked over after she'd left and collected the coins $1.87 that he dropped into his own pocket, rather than the cash register, because putting it in the register would require explaining to Robert why he was accepting partial payment, and James didn't have energy for that conversation. Diane appeared beside him, voice carrying the judgment she seemed to specialize in delivering. "You're just encouraging her." encouraging her to what? Eat breakfast. Encouraging her to keep coming back, expecting free food. Good, I hope she does keep coming back. Diane stared at him like he'd announced he was planning to burn down the cafe for the insurance money. You're going to get yourself fired. Then I'll get fired. He walked away before Diane could continue, before she could explain all the reasons his choices were stupid and self-destructive and against his own interests, before she could articulate all the arguments he'd already had with himself in the hours when he couldn't sleep, and worried about exactly how many acts of compassion he could afford, before compassion cost him everything he'd been struggling to preserve. The pattern repeated itself with variations that were minimal, but significant. Day 2. The woman arrived at 6:38 a.m. James brought her coffee and toast. She placed coins on the table this time, $2.14. James accepted it without comment. She ate slowly, wrote in her notebook, left without speaking. Day 3. Same time, same table. This time she only had $1.39. James brought her the food anyway. Diane made increasingly pointed comments about cafe policy and customer expectations and financial sustainability. James ignored her with practice that came from ignoring his creditors' letters. Day 4, the woman didn't come. James made the coffee and toast anyway, set it on her table, left it there even though the seat was empty. The coffee went cold. The toast got hard. He threw it away at the end of his shift, feeling oddly disappointed by her absence. Day 5. She was back, looked thinner than before if that was possible, jacket hanging looser on frame, that suggested she wasn't eating regularly outside of whatever she managed at the cafe. She had 87 cents this time. James brought her eggs along with the coffee and toast, used his own money to pay for the eggs, told himself this was sustainable when he knew it absolutely wasn't. Carlos watched him do it, and after the woman left, pulled James aside in the kitchen where Diane couldn't hear. His voice was quiet, accented with the Spanish he'd spoken first and longer than English. You know she's homeless. Yes. I figured. So why you doing this, feeding her? James leaned against the prep counter, suddenly exhausted in ways that had nothing to do with the early hour and everything to do with trying to explain motivations he didn't fully understand himself. Because everyone's got to eat, Carlos. And if we're throwing away food at the end of every shift anyway, what's the harm in making sure someone who needs it gets it while it's still fresh? Carlos studied him with eyes that had seen enough hardship to recognize genuine compassion versus performative charity. You got a good heart, James, but good hearts don't pay rent. You be careful. I'm always careful. No, you're not. That's your problem. On day 7, she spoke to him for the first time beyond questions about price. James had brought her the usual coffee and toast, was turning to walk back to the counter when her voice stopped him. Thank you. He turned back. She was looking at him directly for the first time, really meeting his eyes instead of keeping her gaze down or away or focused on anything except human faces. You're welcome. I mean it. Thank you for... She paused, searching for words, for not making me feel like I'm asking for something I don't deserve. James didn't know how to respond to that, so he just nodded and walked away. But the words stayed with him for the rest of his shift and into the afternoon delivery route, and through the evening when he picked up Noah from Mrs. Chen's and made dinner that was just boxed mac and cheese because he was too tired to cook anything more complicated. Noah asked him while they ate at the small table that served as their dining area and work surface, and everything else they needed a table for, his 7-year-old voice carrying the curiosity that hadn't yet been beaten down by reality. Dad, why do you look sad? I'm not sad, buddy, just tired. Mrs. Chen says tired and sad look the same sometimes. Mrs. Chen's very wise. So which one are you? James looked at his son, at the blonde hair and blue eyes that were all Rachel, at the face that would grow into features James wouldn't recognize because Noah would become teenager and then adult, and James wouldn't know how to navigate that transformation when he could barely navigate breakfast service at a cafe that paid poverty wages. Little bit of both, probably. Noah seemed to accept this. Answer went back to his mac and cheese, asked if they could go to the park this weekend. James said yes, even though he was working extra delivery shifts this weekend, but he'd figure out how to make it work because Noah needed park time and fresh air and all the things that normal childhoods contained, and which James's work schedule made difficult to provide. That night, lying in bed next to Noah, who'd fallen asleep clutching his elephant, James thought about the woman in the cafe. Thought about the way she'd thanked him, the specific phrasing, for not making me feel like I'm asking for something I don't deserve, and wondered what her life had been before she'd ended up sitting in corners of cafes counting coins and hoping strangers would show mercy. Day 8 brought rain. Not the gentle Boston rain that misted and made everything look atmospheric. The hard rain that soaked through jackets and made the streets smell like oil and rust and all the accumulated waste that city streets collected. The kind of rain that made being homeless a particular kind of hell that James tried not to think about too hard because thinking about it made him want to do things he couldn't afford to do. The woman arrived at 6:41 a.m. absolutely drenched. Jacket dark with watered her hair plastered to her face in wet strings, boots squelching with each step as she walked to her table. She sat down without taking off the jacket, didn't even attempt to dry off, just sat there shivering with full-body tremors that suggested her internal temperature regulation had given up pretending to function properly. James brought over the coffee and toast, steam rising from both in the cool air of the cafe. When he set the plate down, he noticed her hands were shaking badly. Not just the cold shivering he'd seen before, but deeper tremors that made her fingers move without her permission. She tried to pick up the butter knife to spread the butter on the toast, but her hand wouldn't cooperate. The knife clattered onto the table with sound that seemed too loud in the morning quiet metal against wood, like small announcement of failure. She stared down at her hands like they'd betrayed her, like they belonged to someone else, and she couldn't understand why they wouldn't obey simple commands. Frustration flickered across her features, quickly replaced by resignation that looked like it had been practiced too many times. James looked at her, really looked at her past the exterior presentation to whatever was underneath, and saw exhaustion so profound it had become physiological condition rather than just temporary state. How long had she been living like this? How long could human bodies survive on insufficient food and inadequate shelter and constant exposure before systems started failing in irreversible ways? Without asking permission or making any kind of announcement about his intentions, James picked up the knife. He cut the toast into smaller pieces with methodical precision, buttered each piece, carefully arranged them back on the plate in neat rows. Then he set the knife down and slid the plate toward her. She looked up at him, and her eyes were wet. He couldn't tell if it was rain or tears or both, couldn't distinguish between the water that had come from sky and the water that had come from wherever tears originated in bodies that were breaking down. "Thank you." Her voice came out steady despite everything else that was shaking. It surprised him again, that steadiness. He kept expecting her to sound broken, to sound defeated, to sound like someone who'd given up. But she didn't. She sounded like someone who used to command rooms and make decisions and speak with authority that people respected. "You're welcome." She picked up a piece of toast and ate it, slowly chewing carefully, like the act of eating required concentration and deliberation. James wondered about her teeth, whether they hurt, whether that was why she ate so carefully. Or maybe she was just that hungry, approaching food with the caution that came from bodies that had been starved enough that eating became complicated process rather than simple pleasure. After she'd eaten 3 pieces, she spoke again. "What's your name?" The question caught him off guard because they had been doing this routine for over a week, and she'd never asked, had seemed content to let him remain nameless server in the background of her morning. "James." "I'm Catherine." The name surprised him. It sounded formal, dignified, like name for someone who attended charity galas and served on nonprofit boards, and had family histories that included summer homes and generational wealth. It didn't sound like name for someone who sat in cafe corners counting pennies. "Nice to meet you, Catherine." "You too." She went back to eating, and James went back to work, but something had shifted. She had a name now. She wasn't just homeless woman who came in for coffee. She was Catherine, and Catherine was person with history and identity and all the complexity that came with being human, rather than just being problem to be managed or ignored. Over the next week, the pattern continued to evolve in ways that felt both inevitable and surprising. Catherine started arriving earlier, 32, 6:28 once, as early as 6:19, before the cafe had technically opened for customers. James started making her coffee before she arrived, having it ready. When she walked through the door, small gesture that saved her the awkwardness of having to wait and wonder whether she'd be served. She started talking more. Small things, fragments of conversation delivered during the brief moments when James brought her food, or refilled her coffee, or cleared her plate. How old is your son? 7. What's he like? Smart, funny, asks too many questions. That's a good quality in a child. Not at 6 in the morning when you haven't had coffee yet. She smiled at that actual smile that reached her eyes and transformed her face from exhausted to something approaching alive. Other mornings she asked different questions. Do you like working here? It pays the bills, mostly. What would you rather be doing? The question made James pause because he'd stopped thinking about rather a long time ago, had accepted necessary as the only category that mattered when you were surviving rather than living. I used to want to be a chef, thought I'd open my own restaurant someday. What kind of restaurant? Nothing fancy, just good food that people would remember. The kind of place where families could afford to celebrate birthdays and anniversaries without taking out loans. Catherine nodded slowly like she was processing this information and finding it significant. Why did you stop wanting that? I didn't stop wanting it. I just stopped thinking it was achievable. What changed? James thought about Rachel dying, about funeral costs and medical debt, and suddenly being single father who couldn't afford to take risks because risks required safety net he didn't have. Life got complicated. It usually does. They fell into silence after that, but it wasn't uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of two people who understood that sometimes the most honest answer was admitting that circumstances had foreclosed on dreams, and you were just trying to survive the foreclosure without losing everything else in the process. On day 15, Catherine asked him the question that would stay with James long after everything else had ended. Do you have family besides your son? No, it's just us now. His mother. James felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the physical manifestation of grief that hadn't diminished in 3 years, just changed texture. She died, car accident, 3 years ago. I'm sorry. Yeah, me too. Catherine looked at him for a long moment, and James saw something in her expression that looked like recognition, like she'd identified in him the same kind of damage she was carrying herself. Do you ever think about starting over? Starting over how? Just starting over. Different life, different circumstances, different possibilities. James laughed, but it was hollow sound without any real humor behind it. I think about it sometimes, but thinking about it doesn't change the fact that I've got a son who needs stability and bills that need paying and debt that isn't going anywhere regardless of how much I think about alternative universes where my wife didn't die and I'm not working 3 jobs just to stay above water. But if money and time and obligation weren't factors, would you want to start over? The question felt weighted with importance that James didn't fully understand, like his answer mattered in ways that extended beyond casual conversation between stranger and service worker. He thought about it seriously, gave her the respect of actual consideration instead of dismissive response. Yeah, I think I would. Catherine smiled, and it was the first genuine smile he'd seen from her, the kind that suggested something inside her had cracked open enough to let light through. Good, hold on to that. Why? She didn't answer, just went back to her coffee and her notebook, leaving James to wonder what she'd been asking and why his answer had seemed to satisfy something she'd been looking for. Day 18 brought Noah to the café. The babysitter, Mrs. Chen, reliable as sunrise until the morning she called at 5:47 a.m. with voice that sounded like death warmed over, apologized profusely while explaining that she'd caught some kind of stomach flu and absolutely could not watch Noah today, was so sorry. Hope James understood. James understood, but understanding didn't solve the problem of what to do with 7-year-old at 6 a.m. when you had to be at work by 6 and couldn't afford to miss shift, because missing shifts meant not getting paid, and not getting paid meant not eating. He brought Noah to the cafe. Noah sat at the counter with his coloring book and box of crayons that was missing half the colors because crayons disappeared with the same mysterious efficiency that socks disappeared in dryers. He was quiet, well-behaved, knew from previous experience that cafe during Dad's work hours wasn't playground, was place where he needed to be invisible and not cause problems. James felt guilty anyway. Felt guilty for bringing his 7-year-old to work. Felt guilty that this was the best childcare option available. Felt guilty that Noah was sitting on an uncomfortable stool coloring pictures of dinosaurs instead of being an actual age-appropriate environment with other children and activities designed for his developmental needs. Diane made pointed comments about workplace not being daycare. James ignored her because engaging would require energy he didn't have and wouldn't accomplish anything except making both of them more miserable. Catherine noticed. James saw her watching Noah from her corner table expression that mixed curiosity with something that looked almost like longing. After about 30 minutes, she stood up and walked over to the counter. James tensed instinctively because his protective instincts regarding Noah overrode everything else, including his compassion for homeless women who'd been nothing but polite during their weeks of interaction. But Catherine didn't approach Noah directly. She stopped a few feet away and smiled at him, and the smile was gentle in ways that suggested someone who knew how to interact with children without making them uncomfortable. "What are you coloring?" Noah looked up shy in the way 7-year-olds were when approached by adults they didn't know. "A dinosaur." "Can I see?" Noah showed her the page. It was a T-Rex rendered in the confident but anatomically impossible style of elementary school children everywhere. Green body with purple spots and red eyes that suggested either creative license or fundamental misunderstanding of dinosaur physiology. "That's very good. You have excellent color choices." Noah beamed at the compliment in the way children beamed when adults took their work seriously. "Thank you. Do you know how to fold paper into shapes?" Noah shook his head. Catherine picked up a napkin from the dispenser and held it carefully, looking at James like she was asking permission. James nodded, curious to see where this was going. Her hands moved with deliberate precision, creating creases in the white paper with movements that suggested muscle memory rather than conscious thought. Each fold was exact, methodical building toward shape that wasn't yet apparent, but which was clearly emerging according to some internal blueprint she was following. Noah watched with fascination that made him forget to be shy, leaning forward to see better, eyes wide, with the wonder that children brought to magic tricks and unexpected kindnesses from strangers. When Catherine finished, she handed Noah a small paper crane. He stared at it like she'd just created actual magic instead of just folding paper according to ancient Japanese tradition. "Wow, how did you do that?" "It's called origami. Would you like me to teach you?" "No." Noah looked at James for permission. James nodded again, touched by the fact that his son still checked with him before accepting gifts from people he didn't know. "Yes, please." Catherine sat down next to Noah at the counter. James watched from his position at the coffee machine, ostensibly working, but really just observing this unexpected interaction between his son and the woman whose life he knew nothing about, beyond the fact that she was homeless and polite and carried sadness that seemed foundational rather than circumstantial. She was patient with Noah in ways that reminded James painfully of Rachel. Showed him each fold slowly, didn't get frustrated when he couldn't replicate it correctly, praised his efforts even when the results looked nothing like cranes and more like abstract representations of geometric chaos. Noah struggled with the folds, his 7-year-old fingers not quite capable of the precision that origami required, but Catherine guided his hands without taking over. Let him maintain ownership of the process while providing just enough support that he didn't get discouraged. After 15 minutes of concentrated effort, Noah produced something that might generously be called crane adjacent, and he held it up with pride that made James's chest ache. "I did it." "You did. You're a very good student." Noah beamed at her, then his face shifted into the expression that James had learned to recognize as precursor to uncomfortable observation delivered with childhood directness that didn't understand social filters. "Why do you look so sad?" Catherine stopped moving. The question had landed like stone in still water ripples, spreading outward in ways that made the air feel suddenly heavy. She looked at Noah for a long time, and James could see emotions working through her face. Surprised that child had noticed what adults pretended not to see, pain at being observed so accurately. Something that might have been gratitude for being seen as human rather than just as problem. "I'm not sad right now." But tears were running down her face even as she said it, contradicting her words with the evidence of her body's honest response. Noah's eyes went wide with concern that was pure and uncomplicated in ways that only children could manage. "Are you okay?" She smiled through the tears. "Yes, sweetheart. I'm okay. Thank you for asking." James walked over protective instinct, overriding his desire to let this interaction continue organically. "Noah, why don't you go finish your dinosaur?" Noah looked between his father and Catherine, processing something he didn't quite understand, then nodded. and returned to his coloring book with backward glances that suggested he was still worried about the crying lady. James looked at Catherine. "You all right?" She wiped her eyes quickly with movements that suggested she was embarrassed by the tears but couldn't quite stop them. "I'm fine. Your son is very kind. He learned it from his mother. She must have been wonderful." She was. There was a moment of silence that felt weighted with all the things neither of them knew how to articulate, all the shared understanding of loss and grief and trying to navigate world after person who'd defined your world had left it. Catherine stood up, composure rebuilding itself piece by piece. "Thank you for letting me teach him. It's been a long time since I—" She stopped, didn't finish the sentence. Whatever she'd been going to say remained unspoken, locked behind whatever walls she'd built to protect herself from her own history. "Thank you." She walked back to her table and sat down, staring out the window at the alley like it contained answers to questions she hadn't asked yet. James watched her for a moment, then returned to work. But something fundamental had shifted. This wasn't just homeless woman he fed out of basic human decency anymore. This was Catherine person with history and complexity and the kind of grief that recognized his own grief person who could teach origami to 7-year-olds and cry while claiming she wasn't sad, and who looked at Noah like he represented something precious she'd lost and could never recover. He wondered what her story was, and he wondered if asking would be kindness or violation of whatever privacy she'd managed to preserve while living without literal privacy in a way that homelessness destroyed it. The conversations deepened over the following days. Day 21, Catherine asked about his dream of owning a restaurant. Really asked not just polite conversation, but genuine interest in the specifics. "What kind of food would you serve?" James thought about it while he refilled the sugar dispensers, letting himself imagine for the first time in years what his hypothetical restaurant would actually look like if it existed outside his abandoned fantasies. Comfort food mostly, the kind of stuff people's grandmothers used to make before everyone got too busy to cook. Pot roast lasagna chicken and dumplings. Nothing fancy, just good food that makes you feel like someone cares about whether you're fed properly. That sounds wonderful. It's never going to happen. Why not? Because opening a restaurant requires capital I don't have and can never have. Probably $200,000 to do it right. Get proper equipment, lease a space in neighborhood where people could actually afford to eat there, hire staff. I'm $180,000 in debt from medical bills. I work 3 jobs and still can't save anything. Math doesn't work. Catherine looked at him with those intelligent eyes that always seemed to be calculating something he couldn't quite identify. "But if money wasn't a factor, if you had the capital, would you do it?" "I just told you it's impossible." "I didn't ask if it was possible. I asked if you would do it if it became possible." James stopped refilling the sugar dispenser and gave her his full attention because she was pushing at something that felt important even though he didn't understand why. "If I had the money and the time and no one depending on me, yeah, I'd do it. I'd open that restaurant and I'd make the kind of food that makes people feel cared for instead of just fed." "What if you had someone depending on you? What if you had Noah and the money and the time?" "Then I'd probably still do it. Because I want him to see that you can build something meaningful instead of just surviving paycheck to paycheck. I want him to know that work can be about creation instead of just grinding through days until you die." Catherine smiled, and it was a satisfied smile like he'd passed test he hadn't known he was taking. "Good. Hold on to that. Don't let the impossibility of it right now make you forget what you'd do if it became possible." Day 25 brought the incident that made James realize Catherine's homelessness wasn't just economic circumstance, but something deeper and more complicated. A man in expensive suits sat down at the table next to hers. He was a professional-looking businessman, probably in his 40s, wearing clothes that suggested success and carrying a briefcase that probably contained important documents related to important meetings. He wasn't threatening, didn't acknowledge Catherine's existence, just sat down and pulled out his phone and started scrolling while waiting for his order. Catherine stood up so fast that her chair scraped backward with sound like scream. Her hands shot out and knocked over her coffee cup. The ceramic hit the floor and shattered coffee spreading across the tile in dark puddle that looked almost black against the yellowed linoleum. She was breathing fast, eyes wide, looking at the man in the suit like he represented imminent danger, even though he was just a random businessman who didn't care that she existed. James rushed over with rag to clean up the mess, concerned about the broken ceramic and the coffee, but more concerned about Catherine, who looked like she was having some kind of panic response to a situation that didn't warrant panic. Her voice came out shaking, words tumbling over each other. "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to. It was an accident. I'm sorry." "Hey, it's okay. The accidents happen." James kept his voice calm, the tone he used with Noah when his son was upset about something. "Just sit back down. I'll clean this up." She sat but wouldn't make eye contact with him, just stared at the table while her hands trembled and her breathing remained too fast. The man in the suit glanced over briefly, saw what was happening, and returned to his phone without expressing any interest or concern or even basic acknowledgement that another human was experiencing crisis 3 feet away from him. James cleaned up the broken ceramic and spilled coffee, aware that other customers were watching. Now that scene had been created, and Catherine was the center of it, and she looked like she wanted to disappear entirely. When he brought her new cup of coffee, she was crying silently, tears running down her face, but no sound, no dramatic sobbing, just quiet evidence of internal collapse that she was trying to contain within acceptable parameters of public behavior. "You okay?" She shook her head but said, "I'm fine." The contradiction between gesture and words was so stark, it would have been funny if it hadn't been so clearly evidence of trauma that James didn't understand. "What happened?" "Nothing. He reminded me of someone." "Someone bad?" She didn't answer, just picked up her new coffee cup and held it with both hands like she needed something solid to anchor herself to physical reality. James wanted to ask more questions, but recognized that pushing would be violation of whatever trust they had been building. So he just nodded and walked away, giving her space to put herself back together in whatever way she knew how. Later that shift, after Catherine had left and James was cleaning her table, he found a page from her notebook. It had been torn out and crumpled and then partially smoothed, like she'd discarded it and then changed her mind, but hadn't quite succeeded in either discarding or preserving it. The handwriting was hers, neat, cramped, filling every available space with words that looked like they'd been written under pressure. Day 247, the experiment continues, still invisible to almost everyone. The chef asked if I was okay today after I panicked. First time in 8 months someone has asked that question and meant it. I almost told him everything. Almost ended this entire thing right there, but I didn't, because I need to know if the kindness is real or if it's performance. I need to know if people can still see each other when there's nothing to gain from seeing. James stared at the page for a long time, trying to understand what he was reading. Experiment. Day 247, chef, that was him, she was talking about him. But experiment in what? What was she testing and why? He folded the page and put it in his pocket, didn't throw it away because it felt wrong to throw away something that was clearly important, even though he didn't understand its importance. That night, lying in bed next to Noah, James pulled out the page and read it again. Tried to make sense of the words and failed. Experiment. Invisible. 8 months. How long had Catherine been homeless? How long had she been doing whatever this experiment was? And what did it mean that she was testing whether his kindness was real versus performance? He fell asleep still thinking about it, dreams mixing memory with speculation. Rachel's face blending with Catherine's face, blending with the faces of all the people James had failed to help because helping cost more than he could afford. Day 28 brought the question that would haunt James for the rest of his life. Catherine asked it while he was clearing her table, casual in delivery, but carrying weight that made the air feel suddenly heavy. "Do you ever think about kindness, about whether it's worth anything?" James stopped wiping the table and looked at her. "What do you mean?" "I mean, do you ever calculate the cost before you help someone? Do you weigh what you're giving against it, what you might get back?" James thought about it honestly because she'd asked honestly and deserved honest answer. "I guess I don't think about it much. I just do what feels right." That's what I thought. She looked at him with expression that mixed sadness with something that might have been admiration. Most people calculate. They do math before they do good. They weigh the cost and the benefit, and they decide whether helping is worth the investment. She paused, seemed to be building towards something important. "You don't do that. You just see people who need help and you help them. Like it's the most natural thing in the world. Like kindness doesn't require justification or cost-benefit analysis." James didn't know how to respond, so he just kept wiping the table, uncomfortable with being observed so closely and accurately. Catherine continued, "Do you know how rare that is? How rare it is to meet someone who helps without calculating. I'm not that special. I'm just trying to get through the day without being cruel. That's exactly what makes you special. You think not being cruel is baseline expectation instead of aspirational goal." Then she coughed. It wasn't normal. Cough wasn't the kind of throat-clearing cough that everyone did occasionally. It was deep, wet cough that shook her entire frame and sounded like it originated somewhere in her lungs where fluid had accumulated and was trying to escape. She doubled over with the force of it, hand pressed to her chest, face going pale in ways that suggested this wasn't first time this had happened and wasn't going to be last time either. James moved toward her instinctively. "You okay?" She waved him off with her free hand, still coughing, trying to catch breath that seemed to have abandoned her. I'm fine. But she wasn't fine. James could see it in the way her hand stayed pressed to her chest, like she was trying to hold something inside that wanted to escape, in the way her breathing remained shallow and labored, even after the coughing subsided, in the way her lips had gone slightly blue around the edges. "Have you seen a doctor?" She laughed, but it sounded like breaking glass, sharp and dangerous. "Doctors cost money I don't have. There are free clinics, community health centers. I can give you addresses." "I'm fine, James." It was first time she'd used his name, and the intimacy of it stopped him mid-sentence. She'd been coming to the cafe for almost a month, and this was first time she'd acknowledged knowing his name. First time she'd crossed the distance between stranger and person who knew enough about him to use his name as address. "How long have you been coughing like that?" "A while." "That's not an answer." "It's the only answer I'm going to give you." They stared at each other for a moment, James wanting to push, wanting to insist she get medical attention, wanting to do something that would fix whatever was clearly wrong. But he recognized the stubborn set of her jaw, the defensive posture that said she'd shut down completely if he pushed harder. "What is your last one, Catherine?" The question surprised her. "Why Tramu?" "Because I've been serving you coffee for a month and I don't even know your full name." She hesitated for so long that James thought she wasn't going to answer. "Then Winters, Catherine Elizabeth Winters." The name sounded formal, dignified, like it belonged on letterhead or building plaques, or the kind of legal documents that wealthy people signed when transferring assets and establishing trusts. It sounded nothing like name that should belong to woman who sat in cafe corners counting pennies. "It's nice to know you properly, Catherine Elizabeth Winters." She smiled, but it was sad smile, the kind that suggested she knew something he didn't and wasn't sure whether knowing would help him or hurt him. "You too, James Sullivan." The warning came during afternoon cleanup on day 31, delivered with the administrative precision that Robert Brennan had perfected through MBA coursework and corporate training seminars that taught managers how to terminate employees without exposing the company to liability. Robert pulled James aside in the kitchen, where the dishwasher hummed and steam rose from industrial sink that Carlos was using to scrub pans that had accumulated breakfast grease. His voice carried the forced casualness of someone delivering prepared speech rather than spontaneous conversation. "We need to discuss your performance." James kept wiping down the prep counter, not because it needed additional cleaning, but because looking at Robert directly would make this conversation feel more real than James wanted it to feel. "What about it?" "I've been reviewing our inventory reports. We're experiencing product loss that exceeds acceptable variance." "Meaning what?" "Meaning food is disappearing without corresponding revenue." Robert leaned against the counter with posture that suggested he'd rehearsed this positioning, arms crossed, in ways that management books probably described as projecting authority. "Specifically coffee and toast. Every morning for the past month." James set down the rag and finally looked at Robert directly. "You're talking about Catherine." "I'm talking about unauthorized distribution of cafe property to non-paying customers." "She pays what she can." "Partial payment isn't payment. It's charity we can't afford to provide." Robert's expression didn't change, but something in his voice hardened. "I'm giving you official warning. Stop giving away product or face disciplinary action up to and including termination." "She's hungry. I'm feeding her." "That's not complicated. It's theft from the business." It's compassion for another human being. Robert straightened, clearly frustrated that James wasn't responding to the warning with appropriate deference and concern. This isn't debate about philosophy. This is workplace policy. You either comply or you face consequences. Carlos had stopped washing dishes, was listening without pretending not to listen. His expression unreadable, but his attention fully focused on the conversation happening 3 feet away. James felt something cold settle in his chest. The recognition that this confrontation had been inevitable from the moment he'd first brought Catherine coffee without charging full price. What kind of consequences? The kind that involve you looking for new employment. For feeding someone who's starving. For violating cafe policy repeatedly, despite being told it's unacceptable. Robert pulled out his phone and showed James a screen displaying inventory spreadsheets with numbers highlighted in red. We've lost approximately $90 in product over the past month. That's $90 in profit that should have gone to keeping this establishment operational. Instead, it went to enabling someone who should be seeking assistance from appropriate social services. Appropriate social services that don't exist or don't have capacity or require paperwork that homeless people can't provide because they don't have addresses or identification or any of the bureaucratic requirements that make accessing help impossible. That's not our problem to solve. James stared at Robert and saw a man who'd never had to make impossible choices, who'd never understood that sometimes the difference between surviving and not surviving is whether strangers showed basic human decency. It's not your problem because you've never been the person who needed help. This conversation is over. Stop giving away product or you're fired. Those are your options. Robert walked away and James stood in the kitchen feeling the weight of the choice settling onto shoulders that were already carrying more weight than they could sustain. Carlos resumed washing dishes, but spoke quietly without looking at James. You gonna do what he says? I don't know. You know what happens if you don't? Yeah, I know. That night, James lay awake next to Noah trying to calculate mathematics that didn't have solutions that worked. Stop feeding Catherine meant keeping his job, which meant keeping the apartment, which meant Noah had stability and food and all the things children needed. But it also meant becoming the kind of person who looked at someone who was starving and decided that his own comfort mattered more than her survival. Continue feeding Catherine meant losing his job, which meant losing the apartment, which meant he and Noah would be the ones sleeping in parks and depending on strangers for coffee, and the whole cycle would perpetuate, except now Noah would be suffering because of James's choices. There was no right answer. There was only choosing which kind of wrong he could live with. The health inspector arrived on day 34 at 10:47 a.m. Middle-aged woman with clipboard and expression, suggesting she'd seen every health code violation imaginable and expected to see them again today. She walked through the cafe making notes, checking temperatures of food in warming units, examining surfaces for cleanliness, reviewing storage procedures with the kind of methodical attention that suggested she took her job seriously in ways that would have been admirable if it wasn't currently threatening James's livelihood. When she reached Catherine's table, where Catherine sat with her usual coffee and toast, the inspector stopped, stood there for 30 seconds just observing, then made note on her clipboard with deliberate strokes that looked damning even from across the room. After the inspection concluded, she pulled Robert aside near the register. James couldn't hear the conversation, but he could see Robert's face going red, could see him gesturing toward Catherine with movements that suggested he was defending the cafe's practices while simultaneously blaming Catherine's presence for whatever citation they were receiving. The inspector left and Robert stormed into the back room. James followed because avoiding this confrontation would only delay it rather than preventing it. Robert spun around when James entered, face still flushed with anger that was looking for target. We just got cited for health code violations. $5,000 fine unless we remedy the situation within 2 weeks. What violation? Having homeless person essentially living in the establishment, creating unsanitary conditions, loitering beyond reasonable customer duration. Robert's voice was rising with each phrase. The inspector said we're running charity operation instead of business, and it's affecting our health rating. That's bullshit. Catherine's cleaner than half our paying customers. I don't care if she bathes in antibacterial soap. She's homeless, and someone complained and now we're facing fines we can't afford. Robert moved closer, invading James's space in ways that were clearly meant to be intimidating. I know you didn't make that complaint, but I also know you're the reason she keeps coming back. You're encouraging her by giving her free food. I'm feeding her because she's hungry. You're creating liability for this business, and I'm done tolerating it. Robert's voice dropped to something quieter, but more dangerous. You have choice. Ban her from the café or I fire you today, right now. No 2 weeks notice, no severance, just immediate termination. James felt his hands clench into fists, fought the urge to do something that would feel satisfying for approximately 5 seconds before resulting in criminal charges and definitely losing his job. You're asking me to tell starving woman she can't eat. I'm asking you to prioritize your employment over a stranger who isn't your responsibility. Everyone's my responsibility. That's what being human means. Then I guess you're fired. Robert pulled off James's name tag with movement that was probably meant to be symbolic but just came across as petty. Clean out your locker. I want you gone within 15 minutes. James walked to Catherine's table, feeling like he was moving through water, everything slow and heavy and wrong. She looked up when he approached, saw his expression, and her face shifted into something that looked like understanding mixed with resignation. They fired you. Not yet, but they will if I keep serving you. James sat down across from her, not caring that customers were watching, not caring that Robert was probably timing his departure. So here's what's going to happen. I'm going to leave here, and I'm going to go to Boston Common. There's a bench near the Frog Pond on the northwest side. I'll be there at 7:15 every morning with coffee and food. You meet me there. Catherine's eyes filled with tears. You can't do that. You need this job. I need to be able to look at my son and tell him his father chose being kind over being comfortable. James, you are going to lose everything. Then I'll lose everything. But at least I'll lose it because I chose to help someone instead of because I chose to look away. He pulled a piece of paper from his pocket and wrote the address. 7:15 every morning. I'll be there. She took the paper with hands that were shaking harder than usual. Why? Because you asked me if kindness was worth anything. And I think the answer is yes, even when it costs everything. James went back to the kitchen where Robert was waiting with the expression that mixed triumph with something that might have been discomfort at having successfully forced employee into impossible position. I assume you've made your decision. Yeah, I quit. James pulled off his apron and dropped it on the prep counter. I won't work for someone who thinks feeding hungry people is worth firing staff over. You're making a mistake. Maybe, but it's my mistake to make. Robert's expression shifted to something more calculating. You know, I'll tell the next employer who calls for reference that you were terminated for violating company policy. Do whatever makes you feel powerful. James cleaned out his locker in 12 minutes, didn't own much that he kept at work, just spare shirt and deodorant, and photograph of Noah that he kept taped inside the door. Carlos appeared as James was leaving, pressed $50 into his hand without saying anything, just looked at him with eyes that had seen enough hardship to recognize when someone was making choice that would cost them dearly. Thanks, Carlos. You're a good man, James. Stupid, but good. I'll take that. Outside the cafe, James stood on Charles Street and felt the full weight of what he'd just done settle onto him. No job meant no income from morning shift, which was his primary income source. Delivery job alone wouldn't cover rent. Catering work was too inconsistent. He just destroyed his own financial stability because he couldn't watch someone starve. His phone buzzed. Text from Mrs. Chen. Everything okay? Noah asking when you're coming home. James typed back. Had to quit my job. Long story. Coming to get Noah now. Her response came immediately. We need to talk when you get here. The conversation with Mrs. Chen happened in her apartment while Noah watched cartoons in her living room, oblivious to the fact that his father had just made a decision that would fundamentally alter their circumstances. Mrs. Chen poured tea that James didn't drink and sat across from him with expression that mixed concern with the kind of practical assessment that came from surviving 71 years without illusions about how the world worked. Tell me what happened. James explained the whole situation, Catherine the coffee and toast Robert's ultimatum, the health inspector, the choice between employment and compassion. Mrs. Chen listened without interrupting, just nodded occasionally while her tea cooled in the cup. She wasn't drinking either. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment before speaking. You did right thing, but right thing is going to hurt. I know. You have money saved. Not enough, maybe 2 months' rent if I'm careful. Well, and then what? James didn't have answer because he didn't know what came after 2 months. Eviction, probably. Living out of his truck with Noah until someone called Child Protective Services and took his son away because he couldn't provide stable housing. Mrs. Chen reached across the table and took his hand with gentleness that made James's throat tighten. You stay here until you figure this out. You and Noah, I have spare room. It's not much, but it's better than nothing. I can't ask you to do that. You didn't ask, I'm offering. Her grip on his hand tightened. You helped that woman because she needed help. Now I help you because you need help. That's how this works when people still know how to be human to each other. James felt tears burning behind his eyes, fought them back because crying in Mrs. Chen's kitchen while Noah watched TV in the next room felt like losing control he couldn't afford to lose. Thank you. Don't thank me. Just find new job fast so I don't have to live with 7-year-old energy all day every day. The next morning, James went to Boston Common at 7:15 a.m. with thermos of coffee and bag containing eggs and toast and fruit he'd bought with some of Carlos's $50. The bench near the frog pond was empty. He sat down and waited. Catherine arrived at 7:23, walking across the grass with the careful steps of someone who was conserving energy for longer journey ahead. She sat down next to him without speaking, and James poured her coffee into the thermos cap that doubled his cup. You really quit your job. I really did. That was stupid. Probably, but I meant what I said, about choosing kindness over comfort. They sat in silence while Catherine drank her coffee and ate the breakfast James had brought both of them, watching early morning joggers and dog walkers and all the people whose lives continued with the oblivious momentum of those who'd never had to question whether they'd eat today. After she finished eating, Catherine spoke quietly. Do you regret it? Ask me again in 2 months when I can't pay rent. She smiled, but it was a sad smile. I'm sorry I cost you your job. You didn't cost me anything. I made choice. Robert made choice. Those are different things. For 2 weeks, James met Catherine at the bench every morning, brought her food purchased with money he couldn't afford to spend, but spent anyway because the alternative was watching her starve. They talked more during those 2 weeks than they had during an entire month at the café conversations that ranged from Noah's progress in school to Rachel's death to Catherine's questions about what James would do if he ever got the chance to open his restaurant. She never talked about herself, never explained how she'd ended up homeless, or what her life had been before, or why a woman with a name like Catherine Elizabeth Winters was sitting on park benches accepting charity from unemployed cafe workers. Then on day 15, she didn't come. James waited at the bench from 7:15 until 8:30, coffee, growing cold in the thermos, food remaining untouched. She didn't show, and he felt worry beginning to coil in his chest like something alive and dangerous. Day 16, same thing. Empty bench, cold coffee, growing panic. Day 17, James started searching. Walked through Boston Common, looking for her sleeping under trees or on benches or in the sheltered areas where homeless people gathered. Didn't find her. Asked other homeless people if they'd seen woman matching her description. Got blank stares and suspicious looks and no useful information. Day 18 expanded the search. Walked through downtown Boston, checking doorways and alleys and the subway stations where people slept when the weather got too cold for outdoor sleeping. Nothing. Day 19. James went back to Beacon Hill Cafe. Robert saw him through the window and locked the door. Shook his head, mouthed something that looked like, "Get out of here." But Diane came outside during her break, cigarette in hand expression that mixed annoyance with something that might have been concern. What do you want? Catherine, the woman who used to sit in the corner. Have you seen her? Not since you left. Why? She's missing. Diane took drag on her cigarette, exhaled smoke that dissipated into cold Boston air. She was homeless, James. Homeless people don't go missing. They just move to different locations. This is different. She wouldn't just disappear without... He stopped because he didn't know what Catherine wouldn't do without. He didn't actually know her well enough to make claims about her patterns or reliability. Diane looked at him for a long moment, then sighed. Check the back booth. She left something there last week. I threw it in lost and found box. James went around to the employee entrance that he still had key for because Robert hadn't thought to demand its return. The lost and found box was in the basement cardboard container filled with forgotten umbrellas and single gloves and the detritus of transient customer presence. Catherine's notebook was at the bottom, partially crushed under someone's left-behind scarf. James pulled it out with hands that were suddenly shaking because this was Catherine's constant companion, the thing she wrote in every morning, the record of whatever experiment she was conducting. He opened it to the first page. Day 1, the experiment begins. I need to know if kindness still exists when there's nothing to gain from giving it. I need to know if anyone will see me when I'm invisible. I need to know if I was wrong about everything. James's hands were shaking harder now. He flipped through pages reading entries that chronicled Catherine's time living homeless in Boston. Day 47. Still invisible. Good. The test needs to be pure. Day 118. Someone spit at me today. Called me worthless. I didn't correct them. Day 247. The chef asked if I was okay after I panicked. First person in 8 months. He kept reading the entries, getting more specific about him. Day 298. He cut my toast into small pieces when my hands were shaking. Didn't make a show of it. Just did it like kindness was default instead of exception. Day 341. His son taught me that grief looks the same in children and adults. We're all just trying to survive what we've lost. Then he found the entry from 3 weeks ago that made his blood go cold. Day 687, Dr. Martinez confirmed what I already knew. 6 months at most. Heart failure complications from the pneumonia. I never treated malnutrition, all the accumulated damage from choosing to live like this. She asked if I wanted to stop the experiment, get treatment, maybe extend the timeline. I said no. I found what I was looking for. I found someone who sees people. That's enough. James stared at the words. 6 months. Heart failure. She was dying, and she'd known she was dying, and she'd chosen to keep living on the streets instead of getting treatment because her experiment was more important than her life. He flipped to the last entry dated 5 days ago. Day 7 or 12, I need to prepare. The foundation documents. The letter for James. He deserves to know why. He deserves to know that he passed every test I could design. He proved that kindness without calculation still exists. He proved I was wrong about humanity. He proved that even when the world feels darkest, there are still people who choose light. I'm ready now. Tomorrow I check into Mass General. I'll make it look right, maintain the cover until the end. But I want him to know the truth eventually. I want him to know that what he gave me was worth more than all the money I inherited. He gave me hope, and hope is what I needed most. Mass General. She checked into the hospital 5 days ago. James ran. Massachusetts General Hospital rose from the Charles River waterfront like monument to medical achievement, and institutional bureaucracy buildings connected by corridors that formed labyrinth designed to confuse anyone who wasn't staff. James arrived at emergency department entrance at 10:47 a.m., out of breath from running half-mile from nearest T-station, and approached the registration desk with desperation that probably looked concerning to the security guard watching from corner. The woman at the desk looked up with practiced professional neutrality. "Can I help you?" "I'm looking for patient Catherine Winters. She would have checked in about 5 days ago." The woman typed on her computer, frowned. "I don't have anyone by that name in our current census." She might have used different name, or maybe she came in as Jane Doe. Homeless woman, late 30s, dark hair, probably came in with heart failure or pneumonia. More typing, more frowning. "I'm sorry, I'm not finding anyone matching that description in emergency admits." James felt panic rising in his chest. The notebook said Mass General. She'd written it specifically. "Can you check other departments? Maybe she went straight to cardiac unit." "Sir, I can't give out patient information without proper authorization. If you're not family." "I'm all she has. Please. She's dying and she's alone, and I just need to know if she's here." The woman looked at him for a long moment, making calculations about whether to bend rules for desperate man who might be legitimate concern or might be stalker. Something in his expression must have convinced her because she picked up phone and spoke quietly to someone on the other end. After 2 minutes of muted conversation, she hung up and looked at James with expression that had shifted from professional neutrality to something closer to sympathy. We have Jane Doe in cardiac ICU who matches your description. She checked herself in 5 days ago with advanced heart failure. But I need to warn you, her condition is critical. Can I see her? Are you family? James didn't hesitate. I'm her husband. The lie came out smooth, automatic, the kind of lie that was technically wrong, but felt morally justified when the alternative was being denied access to someone who needed him. The woman made note on a visitor pass and handed it to him. Cardiac ICU, 5th floor, West Wing, room 504. James took the elevator up, watched the floor numbers tick higher while his heart hammered against his ribs. 5th floor arrived with chime that sounded too cheerful for environment filled with people who were dying. The cardiac ICU was hushed space where machines beeped with measured rhythms and nurses moved with quiet efficiency, and everything felt suspended between life and death in ways that made James's skin crawl, with memories of the last time he'd been in hospital, watching someone he cared about die. Room 504 was at the end of the corridor door, partially open. James pushed it wider and stepped inside. Catherine lay in the hospital bed connected to machines that monitored her heart rate and oxygen levels and all the other metrics that quantified how close to death she was at any given moment. IV in her arm, delivering medications that were probably keeping her alive, but couldn't ultimately save her. Face pale against white pillow's hair spread around her head in a way that made her look younger and more vulnerable than she'd ever looked sitting in cafe corners. Her eyes were closed, but they opened when James entered, focused on him with clarity that suggested whatever was failing in her body hadn't yet touched her mind. Her voice came out hoarse, damaged by whatever was destroying her from inside. You found me. You left your notebook. I read it. James moved to the chair beside her bed, sat down heavily. You've been running an experiment, testing whether people would help you when you were homeless. Yes. For almost 2 years. Yes. Why? Catherine's eyes filled with tears that spilled down her cheeks, leaving wet tracks on skin that looked too thin. Because I needed to know if I was wrong about everything. Wrong about what? She took shaky breath, clearly gathering strength for explanation that required more energy than she currently possessed. 2 years ago, my parents died in car accident. Drunk driver, exactly like your wife. I inherited everything mansion company stocks, $900 million in assets. And my fiance, Preston, who I'd been with for 6 years, left me 3 weeks after the funeral. James felt his chest tighten at the parallel drunk drivers destroying families. Grief that couldn't be processed before the next trauma arrived. Catherine continued, voice getting weaker with each sentence. He told me he'd love the life we had together. Not me. That I was too broken now to be the person he'd fallen in love with. That he couldn't handle being with someone who was grieving so hard she couldn't function in social situations anymore. I'm sorry. I fell into depression so deep I couldn't see anything except darkness. Tried to kill myself twice. Failed both times. Finally got therapy that helped me understand I needed radical perspective shift. Her breathing was getting more labored, words coming in shorter bursts. My therapist suggested I try experiencing the world from the bottom. See what it was like to have nothing. Test whether people were inherently good or inherently selfish. So you became homeless deliberately. I gave away everything except $900 million that I put in trust. Bought clothes from Goodwill. Stopped washing my hair. Started living on streets. She smiled, but it was bitter expression. For 8 months, hundreds of people saw me every day. None of them saw me. They looked right through me like I was furniture. Like I didn't exist as human being worth acknowledging. Until the cafe. Until you. Catherine's hand reached out weakly, and James took it, her skin cold and papery against his palm. You were the first person in 8 months who treated me like I mattered. Who brought me coffee without being asked. Who cut my toast when my hands were shaking. Who let your son talk to me like I was person worth knowing. James felt tears burning in his own eyes now. You should have told me. You should have gotten treatment. I couldn't tell you because I needed to know if the kindness was real. If you were helping because I was human in need, not because I was Catherine Winters, the heiress. She coughed, and it was wet, rattling sound that made the heart monitor beep faster. And I couldn't get treatment because I deserved to die like this. I deserved to experience what poverty actually costs. I deserve to understand what happens when you fall through the cracks of a society that only values you when you have money. That's not you don't deserve to die. Maybe not, but I'm dying anyway. Her grip on his hand tightened slightly. I'm glad you came. I have something for you. She gestured weakly toward the bedside table where white envelopes sat sealed with red wax that looked absurdly formal in the sterile hospital environment. Don't open it until after I'm gone. It explains everything, and it gives you what you need to start over. Catherine, promise me you won't open it until I'm dead. Promise me. James promised because what else could he do when someone was dying and asking for simple assurance? They sat in silence while machines beeped and Catherine's breathing got progressively more labored. Nurses came and went, adjusting medications and checking vitals and maintaining the machinery that was keeping her alive for however many hours or days remained. At 3:47 p.m., the monitor started alarming. Nurses rushed in, began working on Catherine with practiced urgency that suggested they did this every day, but which didn't make it any less traumatic to witness. Chest compressions, defibrillator, medications pushed through IV lines. James was pushed into the hallway, stood outside the door watching through window as they fought to restart heart that had finally given up the struggle. The monitor flatline, the high-pitched tone that signaled death, time of death. p.m. James slid down the wall until he was sitting on the floor, head in his hands, crying for a woman he'd known for 2 months but who'd somehow become important enough that her death felt like losing piece of himself. He'd failed to save her, just like he'd failed to save Rachel, just like he seemed to fail at protecting anyone he cared about from the inevitable conclusion that everyone died and caring that just meant experiencing more pain when they left. A nurse came out after 20 minutes, expression sympathetic but professional. I'm sorry for your loss. Are you actually her husband? Or was that creative interpretation to get access? Creative interpretation, and thought so, but I'm glad you were here. She asked about you. Last week when she checked in, she kept asking if James had come to visit yet. We told her no visitors had asked for her. She seemed sad about that. The nurse handed him the envelope. She left this at the nurse's station with instructions to give it to you if you showed up. Guess she knew you'd eventually figure out she was here. James took the envelope, felt the weight of it in his hands. Thank you. Do you know her actual name for the death certificate? Catherine Elizabeth Winters. The nurse's eyes widened slightly. The Winters family, the tech fortune. Yeah. Jesus. What was she doing living on the streets? Running an experiment, testing whether people could still see each other when money wasn't involved. The nurse looked at him for a long moment. Did she find what she was looking for? I think so. After the nurse left, James walked to the lobby and sat in the uncomfortable plastic chair and stared at the envelope for a long time without opening it. Catherine had asked him to wait until she was dead, and she was dead now. Had been dead for 47 minutes, but opening the envelope felt like final acknowledgement that she was gone, and James wasn't ready for that finality yet. His phone buzzed. Mrs. Chen. Noah asking when you were coming home. Everything okay? James typed back. She died. Coming home soon. He sat there for another hour just holding the envelope and trying to process what had happened. Catherine Winters, $900 million heiress, had spent 2 years living homeless to test whether kindness still existed in the world. And she'd chosen him as the test subject without his knowledge or consent, had documented his choices, his small acts of compassion, his decision to keep feeding her, even when it cost him his job. Finally, as hospital staff began giving him looks that suggested he should probably leave, James opened the envelope. Inside was a single page of paper handwritten in Catherine's neat script, and beneath it was check made out to James Sullivan for $100. The letter was brief. Dear James, thank you for the coffee. Thank you for the toast. Thank you for cutting it into small pieces when my hands shook. Thank you for seeing me when everyone else looked away. This is all I can give you right now, but it meant everything. With gratitude, Catherine. James stared at the $100 bill at the letter and felt something break open in his chest. She'd left him $100. After 2 years of experiment, after dying alone in a hospital, after claiming in her notebook that she wanted him to know the truth, she'd left him $100 and a thank you note. It felt like insult disguised as gratitude. Like she'd tested him and found him worthy, and this was his reward for passing examination he hadn't known he was taking. He folded the letter around the check and put them in his pocket, stood up and walked out of Massachusetts General Hospital into Boston afternoon that was too bright and too normal for day, when someone had died and his life had irrevocably changed in ways he didn't yet understand. On the T-ride back to Dorchester, James pulled out the letter again and read it once more. Something about the phrasing nagged at him. This is all I can give you right now. Right now, not this is all I can give you, but right now, like there was more coming but later after some condition had been met. He thought about the notebook entry, about Catherine mentioning foundation documents, about her writing that she wanted him to know the truth eventually. Eventually, not now, eventually. James looked out the window at Boston passing by and wondered what Catherine Winters had actually left him beyond $100 and the weight of knowing he'd been unknowingly performing in someone else's experiment for 2 months. He wouldn't find out the answer for another 6 days. And when he did, it would change everything. The envelope with the $100 bill and Catherine's letter sat on the small table in Mrs. Chen's spare room for 3 days, propped against the lamp where James could see it every time he woke up on the air mattress he had borrowed from a neighbor. He'd taped the letter to his wall above where Noah slept on the actual bed. James had insisted his son take the mattress while he took the floor, and every morning he read it again, trying to find meaning beyond the surface gratitude. Thank you for the coffee. Thank you for seeing me. This is all I can give you right now, right now. The phrase haunted him during job interviews that went nowhere because prospective employers called Robert for references, and Robert apparently took satisfaction in explaining that James had been terminated for violating company policy. It haunted him while he drove delivery routes that barely covered gas costs. It haunted him at night when Noah asked why they were living at Mrs. Chen's instead of their own apartment, and James had to explain in 7-year-old terms that sometimes grown-ups had to make hard choices that didn't work out the way they'd planned. On the 4th day after Catherine's death, James framed the $100 bill alongside the letter in a cheap frame from CVS, put it on the narrow dresser Mrs. Chen had cleared for his use, looked at it and tried to feel grateful instead of angry, tried to accept that this was Catherine's way of saying his kindness had mattered, even if the material acknowledgement of that kindness was less than what he'd lost helping her. On the morning of the 7th day, Mrs. Chen knocked on the door at 6:47 a.m. while James was getting Noah ready for school. Her voice carried urgency that made James's stomach drop. There are people here. They're asking for you. What kind of people? The kind that travel with bodyguards and expensive lawyers. They're waiting in my living room and they're making me nervous. James told Noah to stay in the bedroom, put on the cleanest shirt he owned, one of only 3 he had left after selling most of his clothes to a consignment shop for emergency cash, and walked into Mrs. Chen's living room to find 4 men in black suits standing with military posture and 2 people in expensive gray business attire holding leather briefcases that probably cost more than James's monthly rent used to cost. The woman was mid-50s, blonde hair pulled back severely, wearing suit that screamed corporate law and generational wealth. The man beside her was early 50s, silver hair expression that suggested he'd spent decades delivering news that changed people's lives and had learned to maintain professional neutrality regardless of whether the news was good or catastrophic. The woman spoke first, extending her hand with practiced corporate efficiency. Mr. Sullivan, I'm Elizabeth Morrison, lead counsel for the Winters family estate. This is my colleague, David Hartford. We need to speak with you about Catherine Elizabeth Winters. James shook her hand numbly, brain struggling to process why Catherine's family lawyers would be in Mrs. Chen's apartment, surrounded by bodyguards. I don't understand. Is there somewhere private we can talk, Mrs. Chen offered her kitchen, shooed the bodyguards into the hallway despite their protests about maintaining close proximity to their principals, and busied herself making tea that nobody would drink, while James sat across from 2 lawyers who were opening briefcases and pulling out documents that looked official and terrifying. Elizabeth Morrison arranged papers with the kind of precision that suggested she'd done this countless times, creating order from what must feel like chaos to the people receiving her news. Mr. Sullivan, I'm very sorry to inform you that Catherine Elizabeth Winters passed away 6 days ago at Massachusetts General Hospital. I understand you were present when she died. I was there, but I already knew she was dead. I was at the hospital when it happened. Yes, we're aware. The hospital staff noted your presence and your claim to be her husband. Elizabeth's expression didn't change, but something in her tone suggested she knew it had been lie and didn't necessarily disapprove. Ms. Winters left very specific instructions regarding you. She wanted us to find you personally and deliver certain information in person rather than through conventional channels. David Hartford pulled photograph from his briefcase and slid it across the table. It showed Catherine, not homeless Catherine with tangled hair and worn jacket, but different Catherine. Expensive dress, professional styling, standing in what looked like corporate boardroom, with skyline visible through floor-to-ceiling windows behind her. She looked confident, powerful, like someone who made decisions that affected thousands of employees and millions of dollars. This is Catherine Winters, as she appeared 2 years ago before she began her experiment in voluntary homelessness. She was CEO of Winters Technology Solutions, a company her grandfather founded in 1983, and which she inherited full controlling interest in when her parents died in an automobile accident. James stared at the photograph, trying to reconcile this woman with the person who had sat in cafe corners counting pennies. She told me her parents died. She didn't mention she was CEO of anything. Ms. Winters resigned her position 18 months ago and placed her assets in trust, retaining only enough funds to conduct what she called her social experiment. Elizabeth pulled out another document. At the time of her death, her estate was valued at approximately $900 million. The number landed like physical blow. James heard it, understood the individual words, but couldn't make them mean anything coherent. 900 million. Yes. The majority in company stock, real estate holdings, investment portfolios, and various other assets that have been professionally managed during her absence. Elizabeth's voice remained steady, delivering information like she was reading quarterly earnings instead of describing wealth that was incomprehensible to someone who'd recently been counting coins to buy Noah's school supplies. Why are you telling me this? Because Ms. Winters left explicit instructions regarding you in her will. Before we proceed to those instructions, I need to explain something about the last 2 years of her life. Elizabeth pulled out Catherine's notebook, the same one James had found at the cafe, now encased in protective plastic like evidence. This journal documents Mr. Winters' experience living homeless in Boston. She recorded interactions with hundreds of people over 22 months. The vast majority ignored her, some actively harassed her, and exactly one person, you, Mr. Sullivan, treated her with consistent kindness, without any knowledge of who she was or what she had. David Hartford spoke for the first time, voice carrying the slight Boston accent that suggested local roots despite the expensive suit. Ms. Winters wrote extensively about you, about the way you brought her coffee, cut her toast into small pieces when her hands shook, never made her feel ashamed for not being able to pay full price, about the way you allowed your son to interact with her without treating her like threat or contamination, about the way you ultimately quit your mom rather than stop feeding her. I didn't quit for her specifically. I quit because my manager was an asshole who thought starving people should be banned from eating. Elizabeth's lips twitched in something that might have been smile quickly suppressed. Regardless of your motivation, Ms. Winters documented the choice and its consequences for you. She knew you'd lost your employment. She knew you were struggling financially as a direct result of helping her. She wanted to ensure you understood that your kindness didn't go unnoticed or unappreciated. She pulled out an envelope different from the one James had received at the hospital, this one thick and cream-colored, with red wax seal that looked like it belonged in historical drama. This is Ms. Winters' letter to you. She requested it be delivered personally after her death and after you'd received the initial thank you note she left at the hospital. James took the envelope with hands that were shaking. She left me $100 in a note. I already got it. Yes, we're aware. That was test, Mr. Sullivan. Test of what? David Hartford leaned forward slightly. Ms. Winters wanted to see if you'd be satisfied with token gesture. If you'd accept the $100 and consider your interaction with her complete, or if you'd want more, if you'd demand more. She was testing whether your kindness had been transactional, after all, and helped the homeless woman in hopes of eventual reward, or whether it had been genuine compassion that expected nothing in return. James felt anger flaring hot in his chest. So even after she died, she was still running experiments on me, still testing whether I passed her criteria for being sufficiently altruistic. She was protecting her legacy, Mr. Sullivan. $900 million attracts opportunists. She needed to verify that you were who she believed you to be before entrusting you with what she actually wanted you to have. Elizabeth slid check across the table. James looked down at it. His vision blurred for a moment before the numbers came into focus. $1 million, made out to James Sullivan, signed by Elizabeth Morrison as executor of the Winters estate, valid immediately upon presentation to any banking institution. James couldn't breathe. The kitchen felt too small, too warm, too full of implications he couldn't process. $1 million, more money than he'd earned in 20 years at the cafe, more money than his entire accumulated debt, more money than he'd ever imagined having access to in his lifetime. His voice came out rough. This is real, entirely real and legally binding. Ms. Winters wanted you to have financial security as acknowledgement of what you lost helping her. Elizabeth pulled out additional documents. But there's more. She also established a foundation in her name with initial funding of $5 million, and she's named you as executive director with full authority to distribute funds according to the mission statement she drafted. David Harford handed James a stapled packet of papers. The Catherine Elizabeth Winters Foundation for Human Dignity. Its purpose is to provide assistance to homeless individuals, single parents in financial crisis, and anyone who has fallen through the gaps in existing social services. Ms. Winters wanted you to run it because she trusted that you'd use the resources the way she would have wanted to help people the way you helped her, without judgment, without requiring them to prove they deserve help, just seeing them as humans who need assistance. James stared at the documents, at the check, at the lawyers who were watching him with expressions that suggested they were curious about how he'd respond to information that would transform his life completely. Why me? I'm nobody. I worked at a cafe. I don't know how to run a foundation. Elizabeth's expression softened slightly. Ms. Winters addressed that question in her letter. Perhaps you should read it. James broke the wax seal with hands that were shaking harder now and pulled out several pages of handwritten text in Catherine's neat script. The lawyer sat quietly while he read, giving him space to process words that felt like they were arriving from beyond the grave. Dear James, if you're reading this, then I'm gunning and you've passed the test I created by accepting the $100 without demanding more. I'm sorry I had to test you even after death, but $900 million makes people behave in ways that reveal their true character. And I needed to know your character was what I believed it to be. You're probably angry with me right now. Angry that I lied to you, that I tested you, that I ran experiments on your kindness like it was data to be collected and analyzed. You have every right to that anger. But I hope you'll also understand why I did it. 2 years ago, I lost everything that mattered. My parents died in an accident that could have been prevented if someone hadn't chosen to drive drunk. My fiancé Preston left me because grief made me inconvenient to be around. I fell into depression so severe that I attempted suicide twice, failed both times, and woke up in psychiatric hospitals being told I had everything to live for when everything I'd actually wanted was gone. My therapist suggested I needed to rebuild my understanding of what mattered. She suggested I try experiencing life from a perspective completely different from the privilege I'd always known. She didn't explicitly suggest I become homeless, but that's what I heard. And once I'd heard it, I couldn't unhear it. I wanted to know if the world I'd been moving through was real or just performance. I wanted to know if people only valued me because of my money and status, or if there was something about me as a human being that was worth caring about when all the external markers of worth were stripped away. For 8 months, hundreds of people saw me every day. None of them saw me. They looked through me like I was furniture, like I didn't exist as human being worthy of acknowledgement. Shop owners asked me to leave. Police told me to move along. People crossed the street to avoid getting too close. And I started to believe that maybe Preston was right, that maybe the only valuable thing about me had been my money and my connections and my ability to facilitate the lives of people who mistook access for affection. Then I walked into Beacon Hill Cafe and you brought me coffee. You didn't know who I was. You didn't know what I had or what I'd lost or what I was testing. You just saw someone who needed coffee and you brought it to her. And when I couldn't pay full price, you didn't make me feel ashamed. You just accepted what I had and treated me like I'd paid in full. That single act of compassion saved my life, James. Not literally, I was dying regardless from the heart failure and untreated pneumonia and all the damage I'd done to my body through deliberate neglect. But you saved my life in the way that matters more than physical survival. You proved to me that humanity wasn't dead, that kindness without calculation still existed, that I'd been wrong about the world being only performance and transaction. I documented everything you did for me. Every cup of coffee, every piece of toast cut into small pieces, every moment when you chose compassion over compliance with your manager's orders. I watched you struggle with the choice between keeping your job and continuing to help me. I watched you quit rather than stop feeding someone who was hungry. I watched you sacrifice your own stability because you couldn't live with yourself if you prioritized comfort over conscience. And I fell a little bit in love with your goodness, James. Not romantic love, I barely knew you, and I was dying, and romance wasn't what I needed. But the kind of love that comes from witnessing someone be better than the world requires them to be. The kind of love that comes from seeing someone choose right thing, even when right thing costs everything. The money I'm leaving you isn't payment for services rendered. It's not reward for passing my test. It's my attempt to give you what you gave me a second chance. A chance to build something meaningful instead of just surviving. A chance to open that restaurant you told me about, the one where families could celebrate without going into debt. A chance to show your son that dreams don't have to die just because circumstances make them difficult. But more than that, I'm asking you to run the foundation I've established. I'm asking you to take $5 million and use it to help people the way you helped me. To see them when everyone else looks away. To treat them with dignity when the world treats them like problems to be solved or ignored. To prove that what you did for me wasn't exception, but is actually who you are in all your interactions with people who need help. I trust you, James. I trust that you won't use this money to escape your life, but to enhance it. I trust that you'll keep working even when you don't even have to, because working gives you purpose beyond just earning income. I trust that you'll teach Noah that money is a tool for making the world better, not excuse for separating yourself from people who have less. Thank you for seeing me when I was invisible. Thank you for treating me like I mattered when everyone else treated me like I didn't exist. Thank you for being exactly who you are instead of who the world tells you to be. You saved me, James, not by fixing me or rescuing me or solving my problems. You saved me by treating me like a human being worthy of basic kindness. That's the rarest gift anyone can give. Live well, help others. Teach your son that kindness is never wasted, even when it costs everything. With all my gratitude, Catherine Elizabeth Winters. James read the letter twice while tears ran down his face and dripped onto the pages, blurring ink in places, but not enough to make the words illegible. When he finally looked up, Elizabeth and David were still sitting quietly, giving him space to process emotions that were too big and too complicated to contain properly. His voice came out rough. She was dying the whole time I knew her. Yes, she'd known for approximately 8 months that her heart failure was terminal. She chose to continue the experiment rather than seek treatment that might have extended her life. That's insane. That's conviction, Mr. Sullivan. She believed that understanding human nature was worth more than a few additional months of life. Elizabeth pulled another document from her briefcase. She also wanted you to know that she didn't select you randomly. She'd been observing the cafe for 2 months before she ever entered. She watched you help an elderly homeless man who came in asking for water. Watched you give him coffee and a bagel and treat him with the same respect you'd give paying customer. That's when she decided you were her test subject. James felt something cold settling in his chest. So, none of it was chance she targeted me specifically. She chose you because you demonstrated character she was looking for. But what happened after she chose you, that was all you. She didn't manipulate your responses. She just created opportunity for you to reveal who you actually were. And you revealed yourself to be exactly who she hoped existed, but had stopped believing could be found. David Hartford leaned back in his chair. The question now, Mr. Sullivan, is what you're going to do with what she's left you. James looked at the check for $1 million. Looked at the foundation documents. Looked at the letter that explained why homeless woman had actually been $900 million heiress, testing whether compassion still existed in a world that rewarded selfishness. I need time to think. Of course, but I should inform you that news of Ms. Winters' death and the terms of her will are going to become public within the next week. Once that happens, you're going to face media attention that will be intrusive and potentially overwhelming. I'd suggest making decisions about the foundation quickly so you can control the narrative rather than having it control you. After the lawyers left, taking their bodyguards and their briefcases and their world-altering information with them, James sat at Mrs. Chen's kitchen table, staring at check worth more than he'd earned in 20 years, and trying to figure out what the hell he was supposed to do with it. Miss Chen appeared with actual tea this time, set cup in front of him without speaking, and sat down across from him with expression that suggested she'd heard enough of the conversation to understand that James's life had just transformed completely. What are you going to do? I don't know. That's a lot of money. Yeah, enough money to never have to worry again. James thought about Catherine's letter, about her trust that he wouldn't use the money to escape, but to enhance, about her belief that he'd keep working because work gave purpose beyond income. She wants me to run a foundation, help homeless people and single parents and everyone who falls through the cracks. That sounds like a lot of work. Probably. Are you going to do it? James looked at the check, at the foundation documents, at Catherine's letter that was still sitting in front of him like accusation and blessing simultaneously. He thought about the cafe, about the morning serving coffee to Catherine, and all the other people whose names he'd never learned because they were just transactions instead of humans. He thought about Noah and the kind of father he wanted to be, the kind of example he wanted to set about how to use resources when you suddenly had resources beyond what you needed for basic survival. Yeah, I think I am. Mrs. Chen nodded like this was exactly the answer she'd expected. Then you should probably start by getting an accountant who can help you not lose all that money immediately. The news broke 3 days later, exactly as Elizabeth Morrison had predicted. Boston Globe headline, Tech heiress dies after 2 years living homeless in social experiment. The article explained Catherine's background, her parents' death, her decision to test whether people would help her when she had nothing. It mentioned the cafe, mentioned James by name, described how he'd lost his job rather than stop feeding her. By noon, James's phone was ringing with requests for interviews from local news stations, national morning shows, podcasts about wealth inequality and social justice. He ignored all of them, except one, a reporter from a community newspaper that focused on human interest stories rather than sensational headlines. They met at Boston Common on the bench where James used to bring Catherine breakfast, and he told the story honestly. About the coffee and toast, about choosing to help even when helping was expensive, about finding out after her death that the homeless woman had actually been testing him and that he'd apparently passed. The reporter was a young woman named Sarah Mitchell, mid-20s, wearing professional clothes that didn't quite fit right and taking notes in shorthand that suggested journalism school training applied to underfunded local news outlet. She asked the question that everyone else had been asking in their interview requests. Do you feel used, manipulated by someone who was running experiments on you without your consent? James thought about it honestly. Sometimes, but mostly I feel sad that she thought she needed to test whether people could still be kind. That says more about what she'd experienced than it does about what I did. What are you going to do with the money? Start the foundation she wanted. Help people the way I helped her. Try to prove that what I did was an exception, but is actually achievable if we all just paid attention to each other. The article ran 2 days later under headline, Kindness Rewarded Local Father Inherits Fortune After Helping Homeless Heiress. The response was immediate and divided. Half the comments praised James for his compassion and said the world needed more people like him. The other half accused him of having ulterior motives, suggested he'd known who Catherine was all along, and had helped her strategically to position himself for inheritance. James tried not to read the comments because reading them made him angry in ways that weren't productive. Instead, he focused on the foundation work, meeting with lawyers and accountants and nonprofit consultants who could help him navigate the bureaucracy of establishing charitable organization that wouldn't immediately collapse under its own administrative weight. Robert Brennan called 6 days after the news broke. James almost didn't answer, but curiosity won out over residual anger. Robert's voice carried performative contrition that sounded rehearsed. James, I wanted to apologize for how things ended. I was under pressure from ownership to reduce costs, and I made poor decision about prioritizing short-term savings over long-term ethical considerations. You fired me for feeding someone who was starving. I understand that now, and I'd like to make amends. I'm prepared to donate $50,000 to your foundation as gesture of goodwill. James felt the anger flare again, but tamped it down because anger wouldn't accomplish anything except making him feel temporarily righteous. Keep your money, Robert. Donate it to foundation if you want, but don't do it because you feel guilty or because you think it'll make us friends. We're not friends. We're just two people who used to work together and who made different choices when presented with someone who needed help. He hung up before Robert could respond, felt immediately guilty about the harshness, but also felt satisfied in ways that it suggested maybe some anger was justified after all. Diane called the next day. Her voice was rough, like she'd been crying. I was cruel to her, to Catherine. I called her names. I wanted her gone. And she was this whole time carrying around more money than I'll ever see, and I treated her like garbage. She wasn't carrying money, she was carrying trauma and depression and the weight of testing whether humans could still be decent to each other. I failed that test. Yeah, you did. James didn't soften it because Diane deserved honesty more than she deserved comfort. But you can pass different tests. You can volunteer at the foundation. Help me figure out how to actually help people instead of just judging them for needing help. Diane was quiet for a long moment. Okay, I'd like that. 6 months later, the Catherine Elizabeth Winters Foundation officially launched with ceremony at Community Center in Dorchester, neighborhood where James and Noah had lived before moving to a slightly better apartment that the $1 million had made possible. James had been careful not to upgrade too dramatically because Catherine's letter had specifically warned against using money to separate himself from people who had less. The ceremony was small, maybe 75 people, mostly social workers and nonprofit directors, and the first 10 recipients of foundation assistance who'd been selected through application process that James had designed to minimize bureaucracy and maximize dignity. Noah sat in the front row wearing suit that Mrs. Chen had helped him pick out, 7-year-old face showing pride that made James's chest tight. Next to him sat Mrs. Chen herself, tissue already in hand, because she cried at everything emotional, and this was definitely going to be emotional. James stood at the podium feeling profoundly uncomfortable, in suit that Elizabeth Morrison had insisted he needed if he was going to be public face of $900 million estate's charitable arm. He'd prepared remarks, but looking out at the audience made the prepared remarks feel inadequate. He spoke from the heart instead. Catherine Winters tested me. She created experiment where I was unknowing participant, and she was observer collecting data about human nature. Some people think that was manipulative. Maybe it was. But what I learned from knowing her, from feeding her coffee and toast every morning, without knowing she was testing me, is that kindness doesn't require perfect circumstances or complete information or certainty that you're helping the right person in the right way. It just requires seeing people and treating them like they matter. He paused, looking at the faces watching him. This foundation exists because Catherine wanted to prove that what I did was an exception. She wanted to prove that society could function differently if we all just paid attention to each other. So we're starting small, 10 families this year. Single parents who are struggling, homeless individuals who need housing deposits, people who fell through cracks because the systems designed to catch them have holes too big to be functional. The first recipient stood when James gestured to her, Sarah Mitchell, the reporter who'd written the initial article about James and Catherine. She was 26, single mother with 6-year-old daughter, had been living in shelter for 4 months after domestic violence had forced her to flee her apartment. The foundation had provided 3 months rent, deposit, job training, program enrollment, and childcare assistance. She'd found job as medical assistant, secured apartment in Roxbury, and her daughter was thriving in school that had resources to address the trauma she'd experienced. Sarah's voice shook when she spoke, but her words were clear. I didn't know Catherine Winters, but I know James Sullivan, and I know what it feels like when someone sees you as human being instead of problem to be solved. The foundation didn't just give me money, it gave me chance to rebuild my life with dignity instead of shame. It treated me like I deserved help instead of like I needed to prove I was worthy of receiving it. She turned to look at James directly. Thank you for seeing people the way Catherine taught you to see them. Thank you for proving that kindness without calculation still exists. Thank you for helping my daughter have childhood where she doesn't have to watch her mother struggle alone. The audience applauded, and James felt tears burning behind his eyes. Because this moment of watching someone whose life had been changed by resources he'd been given by woman who tested whether he deserved to distribute those resources. This was what Catherine had meant about seeing people. After the ceremony ended and people filtered out into Dorchester evening, Noah appeared at James's side with expression that suggested he'd been thinking about something serious. "Dad, can I ask you something?" "Always." "Did Miss Catherine die because we didn't help her enough?" The question hit James like fists to the chest because he'd been asking himself the same question for 6 months and hadn't found answer that felt adequate. He knelt down so he was eye level with his son. "No, buddy. Miss Catherine died because she was sick and she chose not to get treatment. That was her choice, not our fault. But what if we'd helped her more? What if we'd made her go to the doctor? We couldn't make her do anything. Adults get to make their own choices even when those choices hurt them. But we did help her in the way she needed most. We treated her like she mattered. And that meant everything to her." Noah processed this with the seriousness that children brought to questions about death and responsibility. "Do you miss her?" "Every day." "Me too. She was nice. And she taught me to fold paper cranes." James pulled Noah into a hug that was tight enough to communicate things he didn't have words for. "Yeah, she did. You want to make a crane for her?" Noah nodded against James's shoulder. The cemetery was in Newton expensive real estate that Catherine's estate had purchased for family plot that now contained her parents and her. James and Noah visited on Sunday afternoon 6 months after the foundation launch, carrying thermos of coffee and bag containing 2 pieces of toast cut into small pieces. The headstone was simple despite the estate's wealth, just her name and dates and single line that Elizabeth Morrison had said Catherine had requested specifically. Catherine Elizabeth Winters, 1985-2023. She saw the best in people. James set the coffee and toast on the ground in front of the stone ritual that felt simultaneously meaningful and absurd. Catherine was dead. She couldn't drink the coffee or eat the toast, but performing the ritual made her feel present in ways that just staring at her name on granite didn't accomplish. Noah pulled paper crane from his pocket. He'd been practicing for 6 months and could now fold them with precision that would have made Catherine proud. He placed it carefully on the headstone where Wind immediately tried to steal it, but didn't quite succeed. "Is she really here?" Noah's voice was quiet. James thought about how to answer truthfully without being too dark for 7-year-old comprehension. "Her body is here, but I think the part of her that mattered in the part that taught you to fold cranes and ask me questions about my dreams, I think that's somewhere else, somewhere better. Like heaven. Maybe, I don't really know what happens after we die, but I know that what Catherine did while she was a mom, the way she tested whether people could still be kind, the way she used her money to help others, that's still here. That lives on even after she's gone." Noah considered this. "So we're like her experiment, but it keeps going." "Kind of, yeah. We're proving that what she believed about people could be true if we choose to make it true." They stood in silence for a while, watching November wind move through trees that were bare except for few stubborn leaves clinging to branches. The cemetery was quiet except for distant traffic sounds, an occasional bird call, and the rustling of Noah's crane as it fluttered against the headstone. James thought about Catherine's letter, about her trust that he'd use the money wisely, about her belief that he'd keep working because work gave purpose. He thought about the 10 families the foundation had helped so far, and the 20 more they'd be able to help next year as the endowment grew. He thought about Sarah Mitchell's testimony about the way she'd described being seen as human instead of problem. He thought about kindness without calculation and whether it was sustainable in a world that rewarded selfishness more reliably than it rewarded compassion. He thought about whether Catherine had been right to test him, whether the experiment had proven what she'd hoped it would prove, whether her death had been worth the knowledge she'd gained. No definitive answers emerged, just the weight of responsibility to honor her legacy by continuing to see people the way she'd needed to be seen. Noah tugged on James's hand. "Can we come back next week? I want to make a better crane. This one's kind of crooked." "Yeah, buddy, we can come back whenever you want." They walked back through the cemetery together past rows of headstones that represented lives that had ended and legacies that remained, and all the complicated ways that humans tried to matter after they were gone. James's phone buzzed with text from Elizabeth Morrison. Foundation Board meeting Tuesday 3 p.m. Need your approval on Q1 grant applications. He typed back confirmation while Noah ran ahead to the car full of 7-year-old energy that couldn't be contained by somber cemetery atmospheres. The foundation work was harder than James had anticipated. Nights filled with paperwork and grant applications and deciding between applicants who all needed help when resources could only stretch to cover some of them. Days filled with meetings and phone calls and the constant pressure of knowing that his decisions directly affected whether families ate or found housing or got medical care they desperately needed. But it was also more meaningful than anything he'd done before. More meaningful than serving coffee to people who barely noticed his existence. More meaningful than delivering packages to addresses where no one remembered his face 5 minutes after he left. More meaningful than surviving paycheck to paycheck while teaching Noah that life was just endurance test you hope to pass. This was creating instead of just surviving. This was proving that Catherine had been right to trust him. This was honoring Rachel's memory by being the kind of father who taught Noah that money was tool for making world better instead of just mechanism for separating yourself from people who had less. At home that night after Noah had gone to bed, James pulled out Catherine's letter and read it again for probably the 100th time since receiving it. The pages were getting worn from repeated handling creases, forming where he'd folded and unfolded them. Ink slightly smudged from the tears he'd cried reading it. You saved me, James, not by fixing me or rescuing me or solving my problems. You saved me by treating me like human being worthy of basic kindness. He thought about whether that was true, whether bringing someone coffee and toast actually constituted saving them, whether small acts of compassion had the power Catherine attributed to them. Then he thought about Sarah Mitchell's testimony about the way she described being seen as human instead of problem. Thought about the other 9 foundation recipients and their stories of falling through cracks and being caught by resources Catherine had left behind. Thought about all the future people who'd be helped because Catherine had tested him and found him worthy and trusted him with her legacy. Maybe she was right. Maybe kindness did save people not by solving their problems, but by reminding them they were worth caring about when the world told them they weren't. James folded the letter carefully and put it back in its frame next to the $100 bill that Catherine had left as test. Looked at them together, the token reward and the real legacy, the test and the trust, the end and the beginning. Tomorrow he'd wake up early and go to foundation office that Elizabeth Morrison had helped him establish in downtown Boston. He'd review grant applications and meet with social workers and make decisions about who to help and how to help them. He'd do work that Catherine had trusted him to do because she'd watched him feed her coffee every morning and had seen something in his actions that proved humanity wasn't dead. Tonight he'd sleep in an apartment he could afford without working 3 jobs. He'd sleep next to son who had stable housing and good school, and father who could actually be present instead of just constantly exhausted. He'd sleep knowing that homeless woman who'd sat in cafe corners had actually been $900 million heiress, testing whether kindness still existed. And he'd sleep believing that maybe, just maybe, Catherine had been right about everything. The experiment had proven that compassion without calculation still existed in a world that made calculation feel necessary for survival. And James Sullivan, former cafe worker who'd quit his job rather than stop feeding someone who was hungry, was living proof that passing the test could change everything.